So I'm Jensz. I'm a self-taught web developer. JavaScript mainly. I've taught myself Svelte and currently learning React. And this is why you suck at CSS. So first of all, why would you want to know CSS? We can see HTML, it works. You've got your content there. I guess you could live in that. But I'd much prefer the nice, sexy website as opposed to the bare bones website. Now, why not just use something like Tailwind? Well, it gets you up and running with some good, quick styles, and you can see it looks really nice. But if you want to go crazy and do something custom, you have to know vanilla CSS. So, first reason you might suck at CSS is because you write too much of it. How many of these styles do you think you actually need to style ahead? Hands up for 2 of them, you need 2 of them. Hands up for 3. Hands up for 4. 5. 6. Well, we don't need width. Block level elements are already 100% wide, so our header would already be taking the entire width of the screen. You don't need heights. Height's already auto. And you don't need margin. And if you did need to declare 0 as a value, you don't need a unit. Second reason you might suck at CSS is because you use queries to add complexity instead of remove complexity. So you can see here, we've got normal styles for a small screen on mobile. And in our media query, we're adding complexity. Our bin width query. So when a browser is under 40 characters, it'll just render the normal mobile styles, very basic. And then once you get beyond 40 characters, we'll add in the complexity using that extra space that we've got now. So we might have more cards expanding that area. Most people, they might suck at CSS because they're hacking away at it, trying to remove things that they've already declared. Whereas if you add in complexity later, it's much easier to manage. I used to think min width was the only width you should use, but you should also use max width sometimes, because on mobile you might have a hamburger menu, and that's adding complexity. So in that case, you'd also want to use a max width so that on mobile you have the hamburger added with the max width query. So if you're under 40 characters, you have the little hamburger icon and have all those styles for that. And then above 40 characters, it wouldn't apply. So always keep your most complex styles that add things in, put that inside a media query. Don't try and remove styles inside a media query. Does everyone know what CSS stands for? Cascade Style Sheets. Now, a lot of people, they'll read style sheets and they'll be like, all right, let's just declare some colors. We've got some padding, some margin. Oh, this is easy. CSS is just a bunch of things we can declare. A lot of people forget about the cascade. A lot of people think this is what the cascade is like. But what actually is the cascade? Now, this is the main portion of this talk. Anyone guess what the colors of these paragraphs will be? 1 and 2.
Blue.
So what color do we think the first one will be? Orange or blue? Hands up for orange. Good. Hands up for pink on the second one. Yes, it's pink. Yeah. There we go. So for equally specific declarations, the last declaration applies. So like if you're asking a tradie to paint the side of your house and you say, oh yeah, paint it orange, actually paint it blue, the last one is the color that the side of your house is going to be. We'll use some terminology here. So a selector is basically CSS telling us what HTML we're targeting. Then the declaration is basically the property and the value. So like padding 1.5 m, or like your colors, or typography. And then you've got a unit for some values. And then the whole thing is a CSS rule. So back to equally specific declarations. What did I mean by that? Well, specificity also comes into play with deciding what style is actually applied. So in this example on the left, what color do you think the paragraph will be?
Orange.
Orange? Yeah, that's right. What about the second one?
Sea green, yeah.
Sea green? That's right. So the first one, P dot important. So we've got an element selector and a class selector. That's more specific than just paragraph. And in the second example, this is a hack. You can actually chain the same class to increase the specificity. But an ID selector, even if you have an infinite number of class selectors, the ID selector will always win. And here's a nice graphic explaining specificity in CSS. So inline styles, if in your HTML you have an attribute style equals and then your CSS inline, that's the most specific because it applies to that element only. That's as specific as you can get. And then after that is IDs. You're supposed to only have one ID per element. So that's extremely specific again. And we tend to try and avoid these first two because they're just too specific. And then the blue one here is your classes, attributes, and pseudo classes. So if you have like a hover or an active, that's a pseudo class. And this is sort of the second least specific. And then after that, you've got the element and pseudo element selectors, which are even less specific than the class. We've also got some new selectors in CSS. This is the where selector. So this actually removes all the specificity from within. So what color do people think the first example, the one on the left, will be? Red? Yeah. What about the second example? What color do you think the second example is going to be? So everything within the where, the specificity is removed. So within the first one, it'll actually be purple because the where removes all the specificity. So the P is actually more specific, even though it comes first, because it has, of course, we go back to those values for the specificity. It's got 1 in the element, and then where has 0 because it's completely removes all the specificity inside of it. And then in the one on the right, the universal selector has no specificity, and the P selector has 1 in the element, and the where has 0 again, so we get blue. And then we've also got is, which is kind of the reverse of where. What do we think the color on the left will be? So everything inside is, it picks the most specific selector within there, and then the entire thing is worth that much specificity. What color do we think the one of? Everyone's too nervous. It's too new. Blue. Blue. What about the one on the right? Lime? They're actually both lime. So in the first example, of course, the universal, it's worth no specificity. The is, so we actually have, so the P is an element, and the hashtag paragraph, that's our ID. But it actually combines them both and treats them both as an ID specific selector, even if it matches the P. So you can kind of treat everything inside of it as the same specificity as the most specific item in the list. So you see the comma in there is creating multiple selectors. So it actually overrides P dot important below it because it goes off the ID inside that, even though it has nothing to do with the P that it's targeting. In the second one, it's quite easy because it's the P after another P. It's basically, it picks the most specific inside of it. So it's the same as the one above it, but it comes later, so it overrides it. Here's a CSS meme. And speaking of margin, has anyone noticed when you're styling a web page and you haven't even added any CSS at all, and the body has margin already? It's already got a margin around the outside of your page. Where did that come from? You often have to override it. This comes from something called the user agent styles. So in every browser, they actually have their own style sheet that comes before yours. And this is called the user agent style sheet. And you can see here, this is a snippet from one where we have display block on the body, which is per the HTML specification, body is a block level element. And then we've also got a margin 8 pixel on the body, which is actually predates CSS. So before we even had CSS, body had a margin of 8 pixels. And this was when visual browsers first came out. And I think it was Netscape Navigator or one of the super early browsers put it in without doing it through the spec. And now everyone just has to put that in for backwards compatibility. So that's now in the user agent style sheet. And after the user agent styles, you usually have to reset the margin on the body if you want to have, a nice header on your site without the margin around the body. You often remove it, and this is often in CSS resets where you override all the user agent styles to get to a basic starting point. Especially with browsers having different user agents, you might want to use a reset to fix all of the discrepancies. But usually now we have interop programs where all the browsers are coming together to fix that. But here you can see we have the universal selector in our rule applying margin 0. And when we put this in our CSS, it actually removes the margin on the body. But we just covered specificity, and that's worth 0 specificity, and the body is worth 1 element. So, and this actually works. So why is our style overriding the user agent style? Well, we're going to come back to that. First of all, let's talk about user styles. So after the user agent has declared its styles, there's actually user styles, and these are going out of fashion. I don't think I've seen anyone use these, but if you wanted, you could go into the browser and declare all of the fonts be Comic Sans, if you wanted. And that would override the user agent styles, but it wouldn't override the author styles. So we're probably all familiar with the author styles, we're authors of CSS. So these come after the user agent and the user styles. Got a diagram here. So the user agent might say, the body has 8 pixel margin. And then the user might say, you know what, I actually like a lot of space around my body. I'm going to put that as 20 pixels margin around the body. And that would override the user agent. Oh, but then we might say, we don't want any margin around the body, so we override that. And it goes from left to right. And the last in is the first to have the final say. But what about important? So I like to think of important as a loaded gun. It's a last resort. This is what happens when we use So you can see here, if we use important on our own styles, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot because you shouldn't need it. You should be able to just write your styles without having to override yourself, but it's there for certain situations. And then actually the user important styles come after yours. So if the user really wants Comic Sans on your website, you can't do anything about that. If they use important, your website is in Comic Sans. And then the user agent actually has the first say and the last say. So if you really have to have something work a certain way in your browser, you can have the final say. And I actually went through the user agent styles and I was like, what's actually important in there? And they've got something about like audio, if there's no controls on it, it's forced to be display none. And iframes, if they're in full screen, it removes the border and padding, which is interesting. So there's some of the styles that you can't override as well. And then we've also got animations. So I was quite surprised, but it makes sense. So animations, if you declare your keyframes in your CSS, that's more important than author styles, but it won't override styles that you've declared with important. So maybe that's a use for important. And then very surprisingly, transitions override everything. They get the complete final say. So if you're transitioning something, it will even override the important user agent styles. Here's another CSS meme. Okay, so with all this CSS, most of it is in the author styles. So yes, we have a user agent. Yes, we have user styles, but they don't really get used too much. Most of our CSS is author CSS. And we're starting to have less and less of just one author. So it's not just you making your site. You might pull in something like Tailwind, Bootstrap, or all these other frameworks. And maybe you want to override something they've done in their framework, but you're not specific enough. So how would you override those styles? Well, we don't want to use important because that's a loaded gun. If everything's important, nothing's important. So that's where we have this new feature in CSS is Cascade Layers. So can anyone guess what order these apply in? So we've got our layer styles where it's its own cascade sort of section. So like we have user agents, user styles, author styles. This is like you're creating your own sections within the author styles. It actually starts off with our layered styles. So you can have as many layers as you want, and all of your layers are applied first, and then all the styles outside your layers, and then your important styles outside layers, and then the important layer styles. So it's always sort of like a sandwich where it goes in normal order and then back out in reverse. And you can have the layers in certain orders, and it will basically, you could have your frameworks up the top and then have your CSS underneath, maybe in a layer or not in a layer, and yours is applied after theirs. So you can override without having to use important. So your code won't end up being like this. Now, all of this cascading, all these styles, the browser finally realizes, all right, we want that div to be purple. And all of these styles, they all combine into something called the CSS Object Model. This is similar to the document object model with HTML. It's basically a computational sort of picture the browser has of what styles apply to what elements, and then it combines the DOM and the CSS into a final render tree, and now it knows everything that it wants to basically draw to the page. So this is we've talked about the styling. So we've decided, smacked the hammer, we've decided, this div is purple. And then the next step is to lay out all of the boxes on our page. So this involves sort of calculating how wide, how tall everything's going to be. You of course need to know the screen dimensions to do this. If you're on a phone, it might be smaller. On a desktop, it'll be larger. And this video should hopefully load. Yep. So someone hacked Firefox, slowed the layout right down. They call it reflow. And gee, this is laggy. So this is a site loading very slowly. This is everything the browser does behind the scenes, calculating where everything sort of goes on the page. And of course, it's good to know about all this because if you're starting to do animations and you get it to recalculate all this stuff, you can really slow your site down. After that, we paint all the boxes on the screen. So CSS, it's all just boxes. And after we've calculated where everything goes, we paint pixels to layers. And then we composite the layers together in the compositing step. So this is the final step where, like if you have something translucent, or if you have all sorts of Z indexes all over the place, we'll combine all the layers together and then just put it on the screen. It's another meme. Okay. Thank you for listening. Thanks, GDG, for having me. All beeps, don't worry. Everyone scan the QR code. I've got some more resources for how you can suck less at CSS on there. So. People often get confused with what's value to declare in Flexbox and Grid. Box sizing, we're deciding when we declare width and height on an element. What box is that height and width actually saying? So content box, it's saying it's the actual content and not including the padding in the width. This one's less funny, it's more painful. Any questions about the talk or CSS in general?
Yes. What are your thoughts on Tailwind?
I knew I'd get that question. I haven't delved into it. It's just someone else's CSS essentially. So I wanted to learn the underlying language first, and I'll probably get to it eventually. But the way I understand it, it's basically a solution that someone arrived at themselves, having dealt with the issue with difference of concerns. So HTML is supposed to be your markup and contain all the content of your website. And then CSS is supposed to style that content. And the guy that invented Tailwind, he was realizing that he was changing his CSS constantly to, was making it super complicated and annoying to use in order to not change the HTML. And he kind of just realized, why not just have my styles in my HTML? That would be so much easier. And it's kind of contradictory ideas between, people that like Tailwind, you want to keep all the styles in the HTML and it's just all in one place. And then the CSS is just hooked in from the HTML. Whereas if you look at CSS Coding Garden, they like to see where you have one set of HTML and then you could have all sorts of different style sheets and they all style the site. So it's sort of the difference between, should I style my HTML in the HTML or should I have it separate in the CSS? It's sort of where to put what depends on what, essentially.
Yeah. More questions? If not, I'm going to ask one. What are your thoughts on SAS?
So it's a good question because a lot of SAS is actually moving into CSS. So we actually have variables in CSS now with custom properties. So I guess you could use SAS variables if you don't want to send them to the client and you just need them on your local machine. But even then, the performance benefit is fairly small. We're now getting trigonometric functions and like I said, Cascade Layers and all sorts of complex stuff, and it just keeps CSS keeps growing and growing, and we're getting new features every month essentially. So I kind of see SAS as sort of the inspiration for future CSS, and sort of just CSS is starting to include SAS in its own flavor.
Nice talk, thanks. What are your views on CSS container queries?
Another thing that I haven't looked into enough. I think they're really good as something to use instead of media queries, because media queries let you style your entire website based on the global width, whereas container queries with the web, we're finding more and more smaller components that all join together to make a larger whole. And inside those smaller components, you might have no idea where your component actually is on the page, or even worse, you might have it in two spots, and depending on which spot it's in and how much width it's got to grow, you want it to do different things. If you wanted to use a media query for that, it's not possible. Whereas with container queries, you can actually get the width wherever you are, and it's basically like a media query that's more portable, you can use in smaller components, and I think it's really good.
Any more questions? I have one. Where did you get these hilarious memes?
Yeah, so I'm in a lot of Discord servers, and we have meme channels, and a few of them I think I made a year or two ago. Yeah, a lot of them are to do with things being out of a line, and it's just hilarious.
Yeah.
If I see more things in real life that I can apply a CSS meme to, I'll share it with you.
Yeah.